Welcome to the WNBA's Author Talk with Julia Glass. My name is Julie Frey, and I am a member of the Greater Philadelphia chapter, and I serve as the WNBA's Communications Chair. If you aren't familiar with the WNBA, we turned 103 today, so it's our birthday. For over a century, we've been committed to supporting books and women in the literary world. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Julia. Julia is the critically acclaimed author of 6 novels. Among her many achievements, she has won the National Book Award, fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She's been an artist in resident and taught writing workshops at several prestigious programs. She is now a distinguished writer in residence at Emerson College, teaching in the Writing, Literature, and Publishing department. Thank you, Julie, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're so happy. If you are joining us on Zoom, please feel free to write any questions you have in the Q&A. If you're on Facebook, you can leave questions in the comments and I will look at them at the end. So to start off, so many of your stories go into backstories. So let's start there tonight and get a bit of your backstory. Can you tell us about your childhood? Were you a bookish kid?
Oh my God, well, of course I was. But I have to tell you, I
Please.
call myself the flashback queen when it comes
You
to
are.
I am. And I've been told that I write flashbacks within flashbacks within flashbacks. So I had to check that out, but apparently I do. So as far as my flashbacks go, I'm one of those, I feel as if most writers I know either grew up in a household full of books or they grew up in a household where maybe there weren't books, but they somehow found their way to a library. Maybe a library was kind of the place their parents dropped them off in the afternoons. So I'm one of the lucky people who grew up in a house that was absolutely groaning under the weight of books. My father, when I was born, was a PhD student in archaeology at Harvard University, and he was reading about Mesoamerican culture. So I have early memories of sitting in his study in our house, which was filled with books, many of them in Spanish, some of them in Nahuatl, and I could pull books off the lower shelves and look at them, and some of them were facsimiles of pictorial manuscripts of Aztec sacrifices.
Wow.
I have very early memories of some pretty grisly images. But my father and my mother read out loud to me a lot. So, and I was very verbal. I talked late, but I was that kind of child who started talking in complete sentences. And when my parents had dinner parties, I refused to go to bed. I would just stand in the room and tell stories, just make up stories. So I was really, in a way, I think, destined to be a storyteller of some kind. And I had wonderful English teachers, all the way through high school. But I also love the visual arts. And when I went to college, and again, I was very fortunate, I went to Yale in the mid-70s, back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I discovered very quickly that the study of literature was very much in the stranglehold of deconstructionism and semiotics, and a way of looking at literature that to me was like dissecting frogs. During my time at Yale, I took exactly 2 English courses, couldn't stand either one. And I wrote a million papers in a million subjects. And in a way, once again, the gods were telling me I was meant to be a writer, but I was following my other passion, which was painting. As you can see, I love color, and I'm not a painter anymore, but I fill my home with pictures and patterns and color. And so I majored in art, and I went off to France for a year with a fellowship to paint. And I came back and I moved to New York like all struggling artists, but I supported my ambition as a painter through my 20s with my word skills. I started out as a proofreader, then I was a copy editor. My first published writing was a pet column for Glamour magazine, because I grew up in a house of animals. I knew a lot about animals, but still, really until I was about 30, where I wanted to succeed was as a painter and a draftsman. But I read like crazy. I read more fiction in my 20s than I'll ever read in the rest of my life. And I began to realize, partly because on weekends I'd start for the art museum and end up at the bookstore. I felt like I was kind of having an affair with books, looking at, and I started writing stories in my early 30s, and I started submitting, and any sane person would have quit. It took me 7 years to get a story published, and it was not in the New Yorker. And it took me another 7 years to get my first novel published, which was when I was 46. And as I like to tell my 20-something students, to some people, I'm a complete nightmare. All these 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds who are dying to have that sexy debut novel
Right.
before they see their first gray hair. But I'm inspiring to people who
Yes.
believe it's never too late. So I've been making up for lost time. So I have managed to write a few books since then. But I had a somewhat unconventional path to becoming a fiction writer. But if you look back to the very beginning, the writing was sort of on the wall, so to speak. I really loved books, loved reading, and I grew up with parents who could not have encouraged that more.
It's great. And I would think, well, I'm a copy editor too. So having that love of words, we may not be writing the words, but we still have that passion for them. And so you were just feeding it in a different way. Yeah, that's great. But to make you feel young when you first published your book, we do have a member, and I believe it's our LA chapter, who published her first book when she was in her 80s.
Okay.
So there you go. That's a late bloomer.
She had lots of fabulous adventures to feed that first novel.
Yeah, she's actually written a few books since then, and one of them has been optioned for a movie. I'm like, this is amazing.
Anything optioned for a movie.
Well, they know she had a finite amount of time, probably. You have a whole lot of books left to write.
Well, we'll see. But each one, as I get close to finishing it, I can't see the next one yet.
Okay.
I'm not one of those authors whom I envy and loathe, who have a million novels lined up like planes on the tarmac at LaGuardia Airport. For me, it's like one at a time. And as I get toward the end of finishing a book, I have this sort of existential fear that I'm going to have to retrain. I'll have to become, an X-ray technician, or, work at the library. I'll have to do something else, because where's the next book going to come from? And then somehow, usually during the period when I'm kind of giving over my new book to my agent and my editor, the other one will sort of come creeping up on the side. So
That has to give you better sleep at night then, when that creeping starts. So with your art, is that something, you mentioned that you don't really do it anymore? Is it something that you feel like you've taken all your creativity and channeled it into your writing, or do you still have a passion for painting at some point?
I certainly love the visual arts, and if I ever have occasion to visit an artist studio and I smell the oil paint and I smell the turpentine, I mean, it's just the nostalgia in me is just so deep and visceral. But and in fact, I wonder if I can maneuver this computer. This is going to be weird. I'm going to see if I can show you a painting of mine on the wall from so long ago. I've not painted since my 30s, but this kind of, well, maybe give you.
Oh, cool.
So you see,
That's really great.
it's not too shocking that I'm showing you kind of a naked woman there, but
No, you're.
so that if I show you that painting, which actually was exhibited in a group show in the Brooklyn Art Museum when I lived in New York.
That's exciting.
In my late 20s, and but if you were to look at that painting, there's so much going on in that painting, and I think I was doing these complicated figurative drawings and paintings where people would say, "What's happening in that picture?" I think I was so longing to tell stories, and that wasn't going to be the way for me to tell my stories. And there are some amazing, visual storytellers, but that I just needed words. And I often say that it's as if I lived in another country for a while, where I spoke the language very, very well, almost fluently. But ultimately, I needed to come back to my native language, and my native language was language. And so, now that my kids are grown and, well, they're kind of out of the nest, but thanks to COVID, they're in and out of the nest. People ask me if I'll start painting again. I would really like to start drawing. I did very intricate pencil drawings that were very realistic, and I actually sold a lot of them. And I think I'd like to do that. I'd like to start painting, drawing plants and trees again. I always loved to draw and paint from life. So I might do that, but mainly I just fill my life with color and.
Well, you can tell from that painting that there's a depth to that color. Even that brief glimpse I got, there's depth there. And that translates into your writing too. You have such depth, and your characters are so beautifully woven. And we've talked a little bit, like mentioned about the backstories and stuff, but with the detail that you go into, like you give a full picture of a character that really makes it feel like they're a real person. And the stories that go with those flashbacks, they feel so organic, and so much like when our minds constantly flip back to past memories or contextual moments when we've like just seen something or heard something or something just trigger something. And I feel like with your stories, because they have so many flashbacks, because we get that depth, it just makes the whole story experience richer. So from that flash of a painting, I could tell that that's just something about you. Is there something that draws you to that depth of kind of storytelling? Like,
So
that's a clear question.
So I'm trying to think of the name of an author. Yes, it came to me. Carol Shields, the wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning Canadian author of Stone Diaries, Larry's Party, number of books. In her last book, Unless is the title of that book, which I love. I love that book. It's a mother-daughter story. Her main character says something that really struck me very deeply because it goes to the heart of the way that I write about characters. And I'm going to try to quote it exactly, but it may be a bit of a paraphrase. It's every novel is the story of the destiny of a child. And this is the part I'm going to get wrong. And the gene pool is always a part of the picture. There's gene pool in there. In other words, it's impossible and this is true for me, it's impossible for me to write about a character without understanding, which means without conceiving of, imagining that character's parents, siblings, grandparents, childhood, a lot of, and every one of my novels begins with one or maybe two characters in a situation of some critical kind. A moment of good fortune, it could be a crisis, it could be a choice, it's something that explains why the story begins there. But very quickly, as I write forward, and I won't plot out, I don't do storyboards or anything like that. I just kind of go forward in the dark. But I also go backward at the same time. Think, where did they grow up? Only child, siblings. And I don't, and I let it, for the most part, come to me organically. And one of the things that really interests me the most about families, and I always write about families, they may be unconventional families, but families are always at the core of my stories. I have always been particularly interested in grown siblings and their relationship to one another as it's evolved over their lives, and their relationships with their parents, and how they look back on how every sibling in a way has a completely different childhood from every other sibling because the chemistry with the parents are different. So those relationships and that history of the family is going to preoccupy me even as I take my characters forward toward the choices that they make, toward the relationships that they form. So I'm going forward and back at the same time. I had a wonderful English teacher in high school who said, almost all stories start in the middle of the middle. and they take you forward and they take you back. And I've always thought about that too. But my editor says something very funny once, and this was, so my second novel, my first novel was 3 Junes. And in fact, that is very much about, grown sibling relationships. There are these 3 brothers, very important in that novel. And my second novel, The Whole World Over, is what at the time that I was writing it, I said to a fellow writer, I think I'm writing my marriage novel. And she said, oh, you mean you're writing your infidelity novel? Oh, that's really true. My Anna Karenina or whatever it is.
Right.
But that book, when I turned it into my editor, who is the best editor in the world, was, it printed out. This was the old days when you stuck it in the envelope and you actually put it in the mail. I had to send it in 2 boxes. It was almost 800 pages long, double spaced, and
Really is Anna Karenina.
so I said, when she got it, and she's so nice, she said, oh, well, Julie, if you really think that this book is the right length, then we'll publish this book, which was, of course, an insane thing to say. I said, no, this is not War and Peace. And this is the thing about my editor. I like to say, if she weren't a great editor, she'd be the world's best diet coach, because we talk for hours about the characters, and then I managed to pull it down. I always write too much. But she said something really interesting to me in that book. There was this one character I'd really fallen in love with. I'd wanted him to be, his name was Walter, and he's a restaurateur, and he's this very wonderful, expressive, but kind of also wholesome gay man living in New York. And I thought he was just going to be a secondary character. And then I just ran with him, and he became one of the principal characters. And I found myself writing about his entire childhood. There was like a sledding episode, and there was like going to the movies, and there was coming out of the closet, and there was all these things in his childhood. My editor said to me, Julie, she said, I love the sense of responsibility you feel toward your reader, as if they have to know when the character lost their first tooth, when they learned to walk, when they learned to swim, when they learned to ride a bike. But you know what? You can keep some of that to yourself. And that's what I realized. That's actually one of the most helpful pieces of advice I've ever had, because, I just let myself write it all out. And then when I'm going through the revision process, I'll say, maybe they really don't need to see this character learning to drive. And then I edit away. But for me, I could not create the characters I do if I didn't delve really, really deeply into their childhoods.
That's fascinating, because so many people say that, I just lost my train of thought. Oops. Oh, well. Sorry about that.
Making people lose their train of thought.
I do that all the time lately. It's my pandemic brain, as I call it. But I'm so glad that you have an editor that you have that amount of trust with, that you've worked with multiple times, and that can give you that kind of feedback, and you not be like, how dare you?
Well, there are writers like that who won't.
Yes. But I'm sure that's been a really successful relationship that you've had, that that you can have her in a very nice way say little bits of knowledge that you need that can help you fix your book then.
I'm a very, in this era of publishing, it is extremely rare to be in the situation I'm in, which is to have been with the same agent, the same editor, the same publishing house.
Yeah.
Except for the first book, the same publicist as I have.
Wow.
Book number 7, I'm about to start doing the revisions on. My editor is just giving me her notes on that book now. So, and this just is sort of unheard of. And both my agent and my editor are people who are really, really good at their jobs, but they're also really nurturing people.
Mm-hmm.
So, my agent is someone who can be, the mother I need when I'm at my most insecure as a writer, and the shark I need when, it comes to contracts or,
Right.
something like that. So yeah, I wouldn't be the writer I am without those relationships in my life.
I think it's a rare thing at times, but such a beautiful thing when we do find those people that we really connect with that can help us, not just for one little period of time, but for years. And you have that relationship, and it just grows and builds. And then you know so much about each other and the way you work that it makes it more seamless. I would think each book there's a little less you have to learn about each other.
Yeah.
Is that true?
It's true. And I get very sentimental, but when I talk to my editor, and it's not, we talk once every several months.
Mhm.
And during the pandemic, we really didn't speak for 6 months. And then we'll speak on the phone for 2 to 3 hours because we also have to hear about each other's kids and stuff.
Sure.
And although she's 10 years younger than I am, her kids are kind of in the same age range as
Mhm.
mine. And I just realized that her son, who is starting college, was the one, she was in labor with him when she called to tell me that 3 Junes had been selected by the Good Morning America book club or something like that. She said, nobody else is telling you this piece of news.
Aw.
In labor. And it was like, and I think of that, and it's just, passages of life.
Well, and it's great when you have someone that commits to their work in a way that's relatable
Mhm.
and actually looks out for you, because so often an editor's job is to look after the book and the reader and not always. I've heard some stories where writers have felt neglected, but to have that care, I'm happy you have that.
Well, it's, to be empathic with editors. It's a
Mhm.
it's a tough job to be a good editor these days because you can't just edit books anymore. You have to really tend a book all the way into the
Yeah.
marketplace. And that did not used to be the case. Not that there aren't marketing people, and there aren't, but if you aren't looking out for that book, and of course the author, but that book all the way out into the world, it's, it could just sink like a stone. Um, but I don't want to get into talking about
No.
here's the other thing. I mean, I teach at a school that is very well known for all the arts. Emerson is quite well known in particular for its musical theater programs. Performing arts are amazing. Its filmmaking department is incredible. And one thing that I've realized during what we're all living through is that of all the creative artists, the writers are the luckiest. Performing artists are in such a hard place. It's so hard to be a musician, to be an actor, to be a dancer. Um, I mean, how many Zoom plays can we
Yeah.
really, so writers can still write. And even though publishing has been tough, my editor said people are still reading.
Oh, they are.
And so here's something really interesting. I mean, this is a little going off to the side, but my publisher is part of the Knopf group, which is part of the Penguin Random House group. It's one of those big umbrellas.
Right.
She said, you know how well we've done this year? She said, because she said, we publish the sexiest translation of War and Peace. And whether or not people are reading it, it's really true. It's like gone off the charts how many copies of War and Peace have sold. So, and they represent all the backlists of James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. And,
Yeah.
so even if us lowly living writers can't sell as many books, at least we know that, that there are some wonderful patron saints of literature who are keeping our public houses alive. So people are still reading.
It's important. And I know for me personally, I've always been a reader, but I've gravitated toward lighter hearted things this pandemic just because I've read so much romance because I need a happy ending. But people find that when they have a crisis or they're going through a pandemic or they have more time at home, that they can really delve into something that feeds them at that moment instead of they may not have to go to their to be read list. They can find something that they need right now. And I think the fact that we do have so many authors who are much more visible online right now because of not being in bookstores, they're actually online doing events, that feeds into that cycle that people can see, oh, I saw that person on this person's blog or on this person's website and they were amazing. I'm going to go read about that because this topic means something to me now. And especially with all of the so many different situations we have going right now. We have a lot of social matters going on. We have politics going on. We have environmental issues going on. So there's all that topical stuff, but then there's that meaty stuff like the James Baldwin and the Julia Glass that we can get into and just escape and learn something about ourselves as we read. And that's one of the reasons I love books.
Me too. too.
To quickly go back to the arts. So I come from an arts background. I've worked at several nonprofit theaters. And so the arts is big for me. I have hundreds of friends literally right now out of work. Um, and at the WNBA, we are a literary nonprofit, but we're so passionate about other nonprofits and we encourage the arts. And like you said, they're hurting right now. Theaters are closed, movies and TVs aren't being produced. TV shows, art galleries are closed. So having that outlet that we do have is great,
Yes, I hadn't thought of
but
it. It's very hard for
it is.
what scene. Yeah.
But I'm going to tie into 20 Summers because you have a nonprofit that
You're really good. Oh,
that shows your passion for the arts. Can you tell us about 20 Summers?
I would love to. So 20 Summers came about like 10 years ago when a really crazy romantic friend of mine who's also a writer fell in love with this big, old, historic barn in the center of Provincetown, which is, the very last town on the tippy end of Cape Cod.
Okay.
It's a very romantic place. It's like this kind of scorpion's tail of sand, this lovely town that's been known as a mecca for the arts going back a century because of this barn, which was built in 1907 as an art school. It's this huge romantic raw wood space on the top of a hill, but kind of hidden in the woods. Sort of like Brigadoon. Everybody in town knows about it, but a lot of people don't know where it is because it's at the end of this cul-de-sac. And so it had actually been passed from artist to artist through the 20th century as an art school. Started with the American Impressionist Charles Hawthorne, who created it, Hans Hofmann, the abstract expressionist, but lots of people, Jackson Pollock, Norman Rockwell, passed through there and did work at some point in their lives. And then writers, Tennessee Williams, Norman Mailer. So it was this gathering place for artists, and it was falling apart. This was in 2008 or 9. This friend of mine bought it, and he said, I want to create some kind of arts programming or residency in this space, but it needed a lot of work, a lot of restoration. And he really did that work, but we created this nonprofit 20 Summers. And it took us 5 years. If we had known. We were so naive. We knew nothing about creating a nonprofit. This thing needed a new septic system. What we ultimately ended up with was we had to sell it to this couple who gave us a 10-year lease for 1 month of programming every spring from mid-May to mid-June. We have 5 weekends of what we call concerts and conversations, where we might have a string quartet, or we might have an indie girl group. We might have blues singers come from New Orleans. It's a space that only 75 people can be in at once. So it's very intimate. It has this gigantic north-facing window that looks into these trees, where in the evening you hear the birds singing as they kind of tuck themselves into their nests. And you have to climb this long path through the woods to get up there. And the conversations have really been or in part my baby, where we bring together playwrights, scientists, authors, novelists, poets, usually in pairs to talk. Mm-hmm. For instance, this would be names people would know, but the first season we brought together Adam Gopnik and Michael Cunningham, and they had never met.
Okay. 2
authors had never met, and they came together and they just had a conversation for an hour and a half, answered questions. People got to meet them. We sold their books. There's a wonderful independent bookstore that sells the books for us. And we have theatrical performances. And then in the 5-day spaces between those weekends, we have artist residencies. So a visual artist can come and, as was traditional in that barn, stay in that space, live there for a week, and just make work. And obviously, like everybody else, we were brought to a halt by the pandemic. We actually, thanks to the guys who own the barn, we've had some residencies this past month. It's been a little chilly, but the artists had space heaters and blankets. And we've actually had some conversations, some wonderful, brought together wonderful writers. And Claudia Rankin is doing a book group for her new book for us. So actually, if people want to go look, it's 20summers, SUMMERS.org. And our events are free. And in fact, our past 6 seasons almost all of our events were videotaped and archived, and there are some pretty amazing things that you can access there for nothing. So, but yes, we are like everybody else. We're struggling. How do we maintain funds? Are we going to be able to have a season next spring? Probably not. What are we going to do instead? And we actually are right now in the process of just today hiring a new executive director who's going to really do some very exciting things for us. And Provincetown is a town of art galleries and film festivals and theaters. And it's been amazing to see how those people have really banded together to create emergency funding. The art gallerists, I mean, there's a gallerist on our board of directors, and we've really been hearing about what's been happening on the ground there. And somewhat sadly, it's actually the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. So they landed first at Provincetown, but there wasn't enough water and went on to Plymouth.
I'd forgotten that.
Monument is this huge, it's kind of like the Washington Monument. It's like the Guy Monument that pokes way up above the horizon. And there were all these fabulous celebrations planned this year for that 400th anniversary. All, I don't think they can even do the fireworks. So, but we have a lot of company out there, and I'm based just outside Boston. Amazing theaters in Boston. I'm a big theater buff, and try to help give a little and support some of those online performances. But Boston Symphony Orchestra, all in music, that there are a lot of young musicians, talented musicians in Boston. It's, I hope we get through this.
Me too. Thank you for sharing. I will definitely include a link in the email we send out with the recording about 20 summers, and hopefully people start to look into it. And I hope that next year you can have some sort of season.
Come,
Yeah.
It's a really
we do have a Boston chapter, so that's helpful. Yeah. One of the things that I think we all know are struggling as well are bookstores. And when I do these author talks, I really want to find out what ways we can help bookstores. And one of those ways is by asking you to tell us what bookstores mean to you.
Oh boy. Well, friends of mine who know me well would go, oh no, she just does not know where she's going. So I'm going to try not to go into the negative part of my soapbox, which is about what Amazon has done to authors' income, to bookstores in general, and so forth. But let me just say that not only will many bookstores, many independent bookstores across the country, ship you any books you want. I mean, even before the pandemic. So my local bookstore, Indie, went the way of many. They just, they failed ultimately. It's now a dentist's office. So we don't have our own bookstore here anymore. And there are many in the Boston area that I love, but one store, but nationally, one of the great things about book tours, and I don't know if they'll happen again, is getting to know booksellers around the country. And I could just go to town telling you booksellers in so many cities. But before the pandemic, one of the bookstores that I started ordering books from was Parnassus, which is Ann Patchett's bookstore in Nashville. Now, they may not need your help so much as others, but when I heard that, Ann Patchett has been a very vocal spokesperson against Amazon in the book marketing place, in the New York Times and so forth. And I think it is no coincidence that a couple of years ago, maybe less than 2 years ago, Amazon announced that they were opening a bricks and mortar bookstore across the street from Parnassus. That's personal. So I thought, well, damn it, I'm ordering all my books from her now. So it's great. Their ordering thing is very easy. And does anybody need their books dropped by drone within 24 hours? No, they do not. You've got that stack that can hold you over till you get those books in a week. So I love ordering from Parnassus. And, there was one book, they even called me because there was this confusion about the ISBN. 3 Lives bookstore in New York City, which was my bookstore when I lived there in the West Village, suffered a lot from lockdown and the pandemic. They they had never done mail order before, but they came up to speed on that. And the way they did it was you went on their website, you told them what books you wanted, and somebody from their staff would call you from their home to get your credit card and talk to you. So you know what? I ordered a bunch of books from them, and this guy from the staff who loved my books said, I get to be the one to call you. I love your books. We talked for an hour. We talked about cookbooks. We talked about food. I said, what's the best novel you've read lately? He said it was this amazing book, Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, who I'd never heard of. I said, put it on my list, add that one too. You know, how are you gonna, I mean, I have discovered so many amazing books and authors just by schmoozing with booksellers. So, but the great thing, and I hope that other authors have talked about this and you probably know about it, is bookshop.org, which is the independent bookstore's answer to Amazon. So bookshop.org, and I don't even, the guy who founded it, I listened to an interview with him. He's a genius. It's, you go to bookshop.org, you can order any book you want, and they give back a section, a portion of the income to independent bookstores. But you can also, so let's say, now a bookstore that I really love that I'm going to throw out there, this is actually my favorite bookstore in the whole country. It's a bookstore called Townhouse Books in St. Charles, Illinois. It's about an hour and a half outside Chicago, incredible cafe store. The booksellers there are some of the smartest people I know. And so let's say that I go to bookshop.org and I say, well, I would like the portion of the books that I buy, that portion, I'd like to have it go to them. If they're a part of that, and chances are they are, then I can click on that and
Right.
they get, it's as if they sold me the books.
Yep.
And so now the fun is when I go to order from bookshop.org, I just think of what was that great bookstore in San Francisco that I loved? What was that? And they're there and you just click on that. So I can even sort of distribute. In fact, I've ordered way too many books. I have like stacks because that's my thing. I'm like, okay, I'm not going out to restaurants. I'm not, I'm hardly getting my hair cut. I feel like Cousin It, but so I get to buy more books. So yes, bookshop.org. If you don't have your own independent bookstore that has, and some bookstores are doing curbside pickups, so you can call them up, order the books you want, go pick them up. Newtonville Books, great bookstore outside Boston that I've done a lot of events at. They've been doing that. So, really, this is the time to.
It is. And we have to. If we don't do it now, they won't be there when we want them.
I mean, I've never gotten to go to tour in Philadelphia. You guys must have some great bookstores.
Yes.
Do you have some independent bookstores?
Yes, we do. And we have a lot of struggling ones right now. And we have big ones in the suburbs as well. And I'm very happy that I live in an area where we have such a rich literary community. But at the same time, if people don't show up for those communities when they need them, they're not going to be them when you need them. So we are a big advocate for Bookshop and IndieBound, because IndieBound can do a similar thing.
IndieBound? I mean, I know IndieBound is, so how does that work? Do you go to IndieBound?
IndieBound.com, okay. And then you can find whatever book you want, and then there's a map, and then you can look and find your independent bookstore, and then it'll order through that.
Okay. I didn't realize that. I was, okay.
Yeah. So for stores that aren't hooked up to Bookshop yet, they might still be on IndieBound. Right. So it's because they don't overlap, like both systems can still exist. Yeah. So because IndieBound is affiliated with the American Booksellers Association. Right. Bookshop. Are
they doing Ingram's? Is it
Ingram's is their distributor. But they were started by, I believe the founder also founded Catapult and Soft Skull.
Yes, he did. That's right. That's right.
And so it's not a full affiliation with ABA, but there is a connection. So pretty much anything we can do to support independent bookstores, whichever way you do it, that's what we need to do right now. Yeah. So that when things come around and you have your 7th book out, you can actually tour, and then you can meet those booksellers. And as a previous bookseller, having that connection with an author and being able to say, I love this book, this book is something amazing that I want to share with you. Having the customers like not sure what they want to look for, but then something to suggest, and it's just one of the most fulfilling things because you're sending this story out that they're going to get lost in, or this book that they're going to learn something about.
In fact, what Newtonville did before they could do even curbside pickup and they could only do bookshop.org, they asked some of their favorite and most loyal authors, and I was lucky to be one of those. They said, give us a list of books that you really love. They don't have to be contemporary, though some would be good. And I just off the top of my head, I noticed the other authors chose like 6 or 7 books. I chose 24 books, but so they put them all up and they said, Julia Glass recommends. And I love, because bookshop.org shows the jackets. So I got to see this row of like 24 jackets of books that I really love. And then they said below, and we recommend Julia Glass. And there were the 6 jackets of my books. So they did this, like Tom Perrotta did it, Margot Livesey did it. Trying to think of some, but they chose all Boston area authors, and that was really a blast. I also loved seeing what Tom Perrotta was recommending and what Margot Livesey was recommending.
It's fun.
Yeah.
There's so many authors recommending things right now, and it's just really, there's so many books that don't get the bestseller title, or they don't get the mainstream coverage. And I've actually found so many more throughout pandemic because the presses are either able to promote them online in a way, or big authors are speaking out to support smaller presses and unknown authors. And I think it's just indicative of how beautiful the literary community can be, that we can come together throughout all this and support one another.
It is. And also, you must be familiar, you sound savvier about all this than I am, but my editor was just telling me about Bookstagram. I know nothing about, do you know about Bookstagram?
Well, when you have Bookstagram, it's pretty much,
I'm sorry.
So on Instagram,
yeah,
if you all you post is pretty much about books, you have a Bookstagram. You're a Bookstagrammer.
Okay, but is it a subset of Instagram? You do
It's the way
I don't do Instagram. I don't do anything.
It's just everybody on Instagram can choose what they choose to post. And there are a lot of people who only post about books. So they become big influencers because they're showing about books and getting people to learn about new authors. And it's a nice thing that social media can do.
Yeah. So no, my editor said that she recently, had a debut novel. I think it's called You Ride on Sticks.
Okay.
And somebody on Bookstagram who is followed hugely raved about this book. And she said, I think it did more for that book than if it had been on the front of the New York Times book review.
I might be mistaken when I say this, but I think that Sarah Jessica Parker got her imprint because of how much she would recommend books. I don't know if she had an actual Instagram account where she did it, but because she was such a proponent for books, and the same with Reese Witherspoon, she started her book club because people got to know that she loves books and stuff. So when you have people with that kind of clout that can say, well, I mean, that's how a lot of movies get made. If a star falls in love with a book and advocates for that book, then a movie gets made. Right. But that's very complicated, and we don't have time to go into all of that. But let's circle back to your writing. Let's see. Let me just get up a question because I know I missed one of them. Well, okay, this one actually ties into the movie comment I just made. So when I read or I hear something, I picture it as a movie in my mind. A lot of people do that. My best friend, she sees cartoons, but but for me, when I was reading A House Among the Trees, I didn't have to do anything on my own. I didn't have to imagine anything because you gave it all to me. And that was so rewarding because I could just see every single piece. And even the structure at times was reminiscent of a screenplay. And so I want to know, are you a movie fan?
I am, but not, I love the movies. I mean, it's another form of storytelling that when it works well, it couldn't be in any other form. Just like a great painting couldn't be anything other than a great painting. But I'm sort of put to shame by my 24-year-old son who, was starting the struggling actor in New York thing when it was all brought to a grinding halt. So he really, he's a member of like this thing called the Criterion Channel that has all these really fabulous.
Oh yeah, I'm aware.
I actually, while he was here in the lockdown, we watched some really crazy old movies that, for like some movies from the 1970s, which was an era when I was a young adult. I mean, I was coming of age then, and I saw a lot of the movies, in art houses and so forth. But we were watching some really weird, like Icelandic movies and things. And I realized, oh my God, I am such a, I'm a Hollywood whore compared to that. I mean, I just, but I love the movies, yes, but I wouldn't call myself, a deep expert.
Okay. I was just curious because, like, just at times there was a familiar structure with the way that you particularly use flashback and the way the characters changed in this novel that I felt was a little different from your others. So I just wondered if there was an influence there. But I sometimes when you have an idea in your head, you just see it because you want to see it. So maybe I was inspired by the fact that Nick is an actor.
Right. I mean, I do think of myself as a very, very visual writer.
You are.
It's totally because of all those years of looking at the world as a painter, looking at like, oh, what color is that sky? How can I make that sky on a canvas? How can I, so that, and I think one of the greatest, every writer has the parts of their writing that is the most pleasure. For some people, it might be doing research. For some people, it might be describing characters. It might be dialogue. For me, it's putting the reader in a place.
Mhm.
And that place has to, and in this case, it was this house among the trees. I mean, the title, this, and actually this book probably shifts setting a lot less than some of my other books. I mean, 3 Junes is ridiculous. It's like
Right.
New York, Paris, the Greek islands, it's all over the world. But this is a very, in terms of place, very focused. But also one of the pleasures that surprised me in this book, because I have on the, 2 of the main characters are this iconic children's book author who, as you can clearly see, was inspired by, but not based on Maurice Sendak. And then this newly minted movie star, this actor who's been working in the trenches. And finally, here he is in his early 30s, and he hits the mother lode. He makes this very artsy movie that wins him every award. And suddenly, he's, what did I have him? Sexiest Man Alive, #9 in People magazine or something.
Right.
And that was very fun to create all this pop culture stuff that happens around celebrity. But for both Nick Green, the actor, and Mort Lear, the author, I created stories. So I made up books that had been written by the author, and I made up the plots of TV shows and movies in which the actor had starred. And so it was kind of that, what are they called, Matryoshka dolls or something, those sort of Russian dolls where you have sort of story within story within story. And I don't know if that's part of why it felt kind of made for the movies, but there are a lot of little stories within the big story. And each of those 2 I mean, there are 2 other very important characters, but for those 2 characters, their lives revolve around story and around characters. They create characters. It's like my characters are creators of character. And that was an unexpected pleasure of the book. I really suddenly, I mean, I could have really gone to town with it.
Did you find that? Oh, sorry, I didn't. Were you?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. Did you find that when you were writing about their processes, like Nick's more method, did you find that you would put elements of your own processes and things, or were they completely unique to the characters?
In the end, so I say this only half jokingly, but as I just told you, my older son, he's passionate about the theater, and he is a talented character actor. And I've seen him in many, many plays. I've seen him in something like 9 Shakespeare plays alone since he was in 7th grade. I mean, he's just been that committed for that long. I think I partly thought, how old he was in college when I was writing that book, that writing a book about an actor would allow me to sort of get closer to him, because I'd ask him about his, and he was like, oh, Mom, I can't. I don't even know how I do it. I can't. So it was like, it did not make me closer to my son to write about an actor, but he was the one who got me fascinated in male performances in particular.
Mhm.
We actually, when he was in college, we went to a lot of movies together whenever he was home. That's really how we would bond, really, and he would focus on those male performances. And we were seeing the really high quality, the movies that play at the art houses. So he focused me on that a lot. And then I went to his room and found a bunch of acting books that he had left. I think, there's an epigraph in the book that's from which actually was my book in college. And then I gave it because I did a little dabbling in acting when I was young, not a lot, but the funny thing is, I thought that I would really go deeply into acting process, and I really didn't. I mean, I talk about what it's like, and it's only what I imagine that it's like for an actor to go from one intense involvement with a character and with a group of people that you're making a performance with, whether it's a play or a movie, and then it's over and you go to a whole new experience. And you might say that's true for writers as well, but it's different. An actor collaborates with a team, and then, unless you're part of a company, you're with a whole new group, and you have to have this very intense relationships. And that fascinated me. It kind of, I thought, well, what it might be like to be in a family and then change families and then change families again. And as far as the writer goes, it's funny how because he's dead, the writer is actually dead on page 1. I mean, it begins a week after he's dead, but he is very much there in all those flashbacks. I couldn't so much go into his process because I could never be inside his head. I was seeing him through the eyes of these 3 characters who have to deal with his legacy. So I couldn't. But after the book was already published, I began to think, I actually began to imagine his studio and imagine other drawings and other stories that I didn't make. And I felt like, wait, I want to put that in. And it's like, no, it's too late. You can't. So I do not, I mean, I have carried characters forward from one book to another. I do not think I'm going to write about him again, but never say never, but I certainly have a lot of ideas if I were to go back and write from his point of view. I mean, that would actually be something interesting to do, maybe.
Yeah. And you're taking my questions. I was going to is more going to show up in a book? No. You could see where I was going. Have you enjoyed revisiting your characters?
Well, when it happens, it's really, it's great. I mean, it also, though, it requires me to do a lot of fact checking on myself.
Sure.
House Among the Trees stands alone so far. But the book I wrote before it, called A Dark Sacred Night, grew out of a really tiny plot point in the end of 3 Junes. And it has to do with a child who was born to a mother who was very young, who got pregnant accidentally. And I really wanted to write a book. There's a character in 3 Junes who's a mother. She's the mother of the character who dies of AIDS. I'm not giving, that's not a spoiler, I think, named Lucinda. And she's a character who was a secondary character I fell in love with. But I couldn't make her any bigger in that book than she was. And I kept thinking, I want to write about her again. I really do. And finally, there I was, book 5. And I said, I really want to write about Lucinda, but how am I going to write about Lucinda? And through that child, it's a secret, I wrote about that child in his 40s when he finally realizes that he has to find out who his father is. And it brings him around in this very roundabout way to Lucinda. Mm-hmm. But it meant that I brought back characters from 3 Junes,
right,
that I knew I'd have to bring back, but it meant I had to actually reread 3 Junes because I'm a stickler, because I'm the copy editor.
Right.
Everything has to be right. So I had to do all this kind of fact checking on myself and it was kind of annoying. I mean, I'm not the kind of person who, if you were to ask me, oh, please read out loud that scene from 3 Junes, and then I would do that happily, but I don't reread my books. So It was very strange to go back and reread whole portions of that book. So, and then I found out that this one character I thought had been an oldest child. And I said, how is he Was he middle? How is he a middle child? He's not a middle child. I made him a middle child. He's not a middle child, but he was a middle child. So I had to write about his older sister, who I had forgotten all about. So anyway, yeah. So getting re-involved in a story can be, it can be a pleasure. And in fact, in book 7, there is a character who comes back from my 4th book, The Widower's Tale.
Okay, we will look forward to it.
Like The Widower's Tale?
Mm-hmm.
You'll recognize somebody in this next book.
We'll look forward to it. One thing I really appreciate is you've had several instances where you've talked about or had characters that had HIV or AIDS. And I really wanted to let you know that I really feel that the way you've drawn those characters as real people and not characters or stereotypes is so important to the dialogue that we need to have in this country. So often people who are characters with HIV or AIDS are either vilified or they're made saints in some way, but you make them very real. They're flawed, but they're human. And I appreciate that. I think that elevates the conversation about characters with HIV or AIDS so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is something that occurs in my books.
Mhm.
And I actually had a very moving experience recently where I reconnected through actually being at the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. for House Among the Trees. An old college classmate who'd been a good friend of mine showed up at my reading, and we, reconnected. And he is the director of global public health for a very big think tank. I mean, he travels all around the world. And I mean, now he's up to here in covering the pandemic. But before that, what he's been doing is studying HIV and AIDS all over the world. I mean, in brothels, in Ukraine, in South Africa, and he has been putting together a series. It's like a mini documentaries about the trajectory of AIDS and where it is now, HIV treatment and pathology in the world today. And he actually asked me he said, I need to have some people who are artists who have, been in, whose art has been concerned with HIV. And he interviewed me for the documentary. I mean, I went to Washington and sat in a real studio, and I thought, what do I have to say about this? But my writing about HIV comes out of my having lived in New York City in the 1980s and 90s and having done volunteer work in that community also. And the way that it kind of haunted me. I don't think I really expected it to come out in 3 Junes as strongly as it did, but he had me revisit what it was like to live in New York, and work in that community. And I was like, I really went deep in a way that I haven't since I wrote 3 Junes, but it does come up again and again. And I have many friends who, I'm in my mid 60s, and many of my contemporaries who are gay men in particular survived that period and but lost so many people. And you never, forget that. And and for a lot of those people, as they come of age, as we arrive at an age where we do begin to lose people from much more natural causes. People have heart attacks, people have strokes, people have cancer. And although it feels like we're losing them young, it's not like it was to lose people in their 20s and 30s. And it feels as if it's not fair, as if for some of them, we already went through the period in our life where we went to funeral after funeral after funeral. Why do we have to do this again? As if you get a pass having survived to be old. So, to write about characters who are caretakers or who are struggling with having HIV is to revisit a part of my past, but it's also to write about mortality and about caregiving, and about some of the, prejudices in our society related to disease and sexuality. And yes, so, and it comes up again in the House Among the Trees, though, again, when I started it, I wasn't necessarily expecting that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
one of the things that your characters always show is that they've persevered through something. And is that a deliberate choice? That they had something that's their big struggle. I mean, beyond like struggles in life, but there's something that drives them and that they end up on the other side. And that gives us a message of hope. And that's something that I get from your books.
Well,
Is
I do like to, you know, like all fiction writers, I punish some of my characters terribly. I mean, you have to get, as a fiction writer, you have to get people in serious trouble, right? I
yeah.
mean, there's no story without trouble. There has to be trouble. And some people don't survive and some do. Um, but I always believe that I write books that end on a note of hope. And I don't mean some sort of smarmy hope,
Right.
but
And
but
it's not romance novel happy ever after. Everybody ends up married and happy and everything. But
but I think, and this goes back, and you've obviously researched me very well, so you know that in my mid 30s, and we're talking before I published anything fiction. I was writing fiction just, for a few years. I went through a year during which I went through a divorce. I was diagnosed with cancer, and 12 days after I was diagnosed with cancer, my only sibling killed herself at age 31. And so that was, that was the worst time I've ever so far had in my life. It was just, I mean, and if my husband, who was then had been my boyfriend for a couple of years, or just newly hadn't been with me, I mean, I don't know what I would have done, but a lot of the suffering I did was intensely personal and alone. I mean, you can go to support groups when you have cancer, and you can go to support groups and have all your friends care for you when you lose your only sibling, and when that sibling chooses to end her life. But there's an aloneness to that kind of grief that is, it's harrowing. And when I was writing 3 Junes after that, I think I was writing kind of on a parallel. I wasn't writing about somebody who's suffering from cancer and suicide, but there was death and there was disease, and there were, it was kind of like a meta version of my life. And I realized something. I said, you know what I'm really writing about? I'm writing about what it's like to go on living and finding hope when you've gone through the kind of heartbreak that is inconsolable, that you will never, when you lose a loved one to suicide, and I won't go into that whole, you will never know the real answers. You will never, it is always this piece of glass in your heart. It's just, it's there, and you go on, right? And likewise, when you are young and you have a life-threatening disease, that sense of, if not immortality, sort of, there's a word I'm looking for that begins with I, but I can't think of it, kind of being insulated against trouble. And by the way, that's what 9/11 did to a lot of Americans. Guess what? We are not inviolable. We are not, impunity. That's the word I'm looking for. You lose all sense of impunity. That is a loss too. Now, I've been very lucky. I'm healthy, and I've been very lucky in that respect. But I think all the great fiction, all of it, and it can be comic too, is about how we endure. Human beings are very fragile in many ways, but we endure. I mean, the things that people live through, live past, somehow you were talking about reading romance during the pandemic. I have read some funny books, but I am always drawn periodically to war fiction. And I have read 2 outrageously powerful war novels in the last couple of months. One was this book that the bookseller at 3 Lives in New York put in my book box, which is Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. And it's a historical novel that's the characters fight in the Indian Wars in the Southwest and then in the Civil War. So it takes you through 2 passages of war in this country. I kept thinking, so I was reading this during the pandemic and goes, so I would not trade living now for living then. Thank you. But you know what? This book has there's so much joy in the ending. It's a brutal, brutal book, but the character you fall in love with, and it's first person, so you know he's going to be alive at the end. But the things he sees, the things he lives through, incredible. And then I also just read, and I actually got to interview him on Zoom for my reading series at Emerson, is Phil Klei's brand new novel, Missionaries. Incredible, epic, page-turner novel about America's involvement in wars from Afghanistan to Colombia in South America. I mean, just, his first book was Redeployment, which is an amazing short story collection that won the National Book Award in 2016. And Missionaries, characters are incredible. So even though I want to read books that are hopeful, sometimes reading books that encompass an enormous amount of suffering can bring you to a place of real strength and inspiration. On the other hand, now I'm reading a delightful comic novel by Barbara Torpedo. So, and that's a great pleasure. So I think I'm going to take a break from war fiction for a little while.
Well, I think that when you do read something where someone has struggled so much, and you can sometimes look at your life and be like, okay, staying inside for a pandemic's not that bad.
Right.
So, what is one of your favorite things about writing?
Oh, I used to joke staying in my pajamas until noon, but I don't know if that's still true. Being my own boss. I mean, that sounds kind of.
It's not flippant. You may think it sounds flippant, but it's not.
All the shots. Now, as I told you, I am not that writer who says, don't you touch a word of my prose when I get to I have my people on whose opinions I count, including, believe it or not, my husband. I keep pointing, he's out there in the kitchen with the dogs. For one thing, he gives me a solid male point of view on my male characters in particular. And he tells me things like, nobody plugs in a chainsaw, or nobody, he catches all these guy things in my books. So that's good. But it's interesting. I had a student once who, believe it or not, was simultaneously getting an MFA in creative writing, fiction writing, and he was getting a graduate degree in film study, And so when we were talking about fiction in the workshop, he would often use movies as his story references. And I said to him, Josh, you're driving me kind of crazy because we are writing fiction here. I said, and he said, yes, but movies are really my passion. I said, well, why don't you want to be a movie maker? Why do you want to be a novelist? And he's very talented. He said, because with movies, you have to share, you have to collaborate. I want to write the story myself and make the story myself. And that's what you can do when you write fiction. And it's true. You're your own, you're your own worst enemy and your own best friend and your own navel gazer. And, it's yours to make. And
lament over and frustrate you and throw at the wall when you've read it and you're like, what did I write? It's all yours.
It is. And it's really a position of privilege. I mean, to have that much power. I mean, ultimately, the reader is the one who's going to tell you if
right.
you do a good job.
But there's like, I own my own business. So I understand that not working for someone and being able to pick the projects I want to pick and work on things that I want to work on gives me a freedom that many people don't have. And I recognize that. So I get what you're saying.
And yet, I think people may imagine that most fiction writers must be introverts. And certainly there are many. And there are people who've also, John Updike's story and how he was drawn to fiction writing in part because of this sense of shame. He had terrible eczema and, he was a real sort of shut-in. But, I love being with people. So, and I'm not saying that I'd rather be in an office mingling up with a whole lot of people. But for me, if I have a good day of writing, the reward is getting on the phone with my girlfriends, or, well, I was going to say having people over for dinner. Of course, can't do that anymore. But, and Zoom cocktails are getting a little bit, a little wearisome, but you're going to have to get to like it again as another New England winter descends on us. So, I mean, I'm a big rule follower during the pandemic. I'm a believer in those masks and the distancing and all that. So, but yeah, it's a selfish pursuit that in the end you hope gives to people, that. And I will say this, I think, you asked me what I like most about writing, but now I will tell you what I like most about having written and publishing. And that is getting to talk to readers, meeting booksellers and talking to readers. The sense of wonder that a writer has the first time you get to go on a book tour, again, please let there still be book tours, when you actually walk into a room and maybe there are only 5 or 6 people there, and maybe, if it's your hardcover and it's your first book, maybe people just came and they haven't read the book, but they're interested in it, they take it home and they read it. And then if you go on a paperback tour or you do a book club, to listen to people talk about your characters as if they're real. And my favorite thing is to go to a book club and have people argue about a character. What a horrible narcissistic mother she is. Oh no, she's does the best she can, and look how well her children come out. And people, then you've really succeeded. But you also hear another thing in book clubs in particular is how do the human situations in my books make them talk about their own families and their own lives. And one of the things about 3 Junes that honestly, I never thought about when I was writing that book. So that book, has gay characters. And so many gay men told me that was the book they could give to their mother or their grandmother to show them what it was like to be a gay man. And partly because, unlike a lot of gay male writers, I don't include a lot of X-rated sex. I mean, it's kind of the fade out. So they felt like my grandmother can deal with this book because, it's not Andrew Holleran. And just
a great gift
that someone would give my book to someone to start a dialogue, to say, okay, Grammy, I want you to read this book, and then, I'm gay, and then we can talk, and real conversations, and books that I read that have allowed me to talk with my husband about. I remember actually was going to a play, but similar experience. When his very best friend from high school split up with his wife, and we could not believe that was happening. I think it was the first close friends getting divorced that we went through. It was before we had kids. And we went to a play that was about 2 couples where one of them splits apart. And that allowed us to finally talk about the split in his friends without taking sides and getting, hostile about it. And art can, stories can do that. You just say, well, that reminds me of such and such or whatever. So if my selfishness can be a gift as well, then maybe I even out on the karma.
We just had a comment pop up saying, thank you for writing about gay characters. I have a son that is gay, and I work with students in the LGBTQ community at my high school. It is so important to make that story become a normal part of our world.
Absolutely. Just normalize it. Yeah. Yeah.
How has the pandemic affected your creativity? Have you been able to work? Like, you were probably in your revision stage probably when the pandemic hit, right?
Well, I was really more, so when the pandemic hit, first of all, I've only been teaching at Emerson College for 3 or 4 years. And the one thing that I've come to realize is that it's very hard for me to write while teaching. I love teaching my students, but reading their fiction and talking about their fiction takes away from that part of my brain. So I've begun to face the fact that I'm really one of those writers now who has to really get everything, a lot of stuff done in the summer and Christmas break. I had the luxury in an earlier phase of my life of being able to write fiction all the time, but that's I need this health insurance. So, and I like teaching, I really do. So what happened was I was thinking, oh, this summer, actually in February, I went on a 10-day writing retreat with 12 other women that I was invited on. That was so great, in a beautiful house by a lake. Just 12 women talking about writing and reading, amazing. And then I came back and I thought, okay, so classes will end in the end of April, and then I'll just hit the ground running and I'll finish this draft of this book. I wasn't, that I'm writing. Well, March, I pivoted to teaching online. End of April, by this point, my 2 sons are living at home here with us. And it's okay, but it's just, it's hard. It's really hard, especially for my older son, who was just in total limbo from his New York life. And not only could I not write or even think of writing, but I really couldn't read anything other than the New York Times. Mm-hmm. I was, partly because I was obsessed with the news, partly I couldn't open a book, really, for a couple of months. And I think the first book that got my attention, I'll tell you what it was, such a New York novel, Fleischman is in Trouble. That book, that got me back on the reading track. So that was good. And then I really could not make myself work on the book until June. I couldn't even really think about it. And then I thought, you know what? I returned to teaching, whatever mode it's in September, and I must. And so I really worked hard, from mid-June to the end of August, got that draft done, turned it in. And now I expect we're actually gonna have a very long Christmas break because of the way they're restructuring our academic calendar. And then I will do my final revisions and hopefully have it to the publisher ready to go into the pipeline by mid-January, I hope. But yeah, no, I had a really hard time. And, I would look at, during I think April in particular, we started to see a lot of essays by writers about living in the past. Karen Russell wrote some great pieces about it. And I thought, damn, they're probably writing fiction and they're writing about life in the past. I could not, because everything that was weird in the pandemic, if you're a writer, someone would say to me, oh, you've got to write an essay about that. Oh, you've got to write an essay about that. Like how many chicken curries I was making, or the way the dogs, so the dogs lost all this weight, and I said to the vet, we haven't taken them on longer walks. She said, no. She said, all the dogs are losing weight because when people aren't in the house, dogs just sleep. But now that everybody's in the house all the time, they follow you around the house and they're losing weight. And I said, well, I know where all the weight they lost went. So he's like, write an essay about that. And it's like, stop telling me to write essays about every weird thing that is happening to me now, because I just need to keep my head screwed on straight. So yeah, no, I have not been extra productive, but it's coming back. And watching my students write through this too is really inspiring isn't the word for it, but it's like, if they can do it, right, I can do it. I mean, a number of my graduate students, they live alone in some, in an apartment in Boston, or they have random roommates, and they can't socialize. They can't go home for weekends. And, I'm just count my blessings. Not to sound like a Hallmark card, but right now, I just really, I hope what everybody hopes for the months to come.
Yes. I hope we can return to some sort of, not normal, because that'll not happen for a long time, but some sort of something.
Well, I hope we can all have the fortitude it's going to take.
Yeah, it's going to be hard.
Because, it's one thing. I mean, in a way, when being locked down with your family was a novel thing.
Right. You could
like say, oh my God, it's so great to have, Nick or John or Mary home. They were away at college. And even though you feel bad for them that they have to learn on the computer, you get to feed them, and yeah. And it's, if you get to do that, if you get to nurture during the pandemic, that helps a lot. But another winter of that, like, wait, again?
Yeah.
So
But we will have to persevere, like you said.
elderly parents, it's like, my mother who's in her 80s. I mean, she's actually furious. She just wants people to visit her anyway. She says, I don't care if this virus gets me, let the virus get me. But it's like, no, we're not visiting you. We're not. My husband does errands for her. But I guess, we're going to probably go take Thanksgiving to her, because there comes a point when, what are you going to do? Just live this sterile life forever. So,
Yeah, we all have to pick our moments when we can be a little reckless and
or,
hope that
balance our risks.
right.
Take this risk and then don't take this one. It's like I read somewhere, okay, so if you have a haircut, it doesn't mean you also have a manicure and you also have a pedicure. It's like, because you had the haircut, you don't have those other things. So,
Well, hopefully everyone.
I'm no epidemiologist, but
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
we're all armchair epidemiologists these days.
I had a couple questions from viewers. And then, oh wow, I'm sorry, we've taken up a lot of your time. Do you have a couple more minutes to hang in with us?
I'm fine.
Okay. If anybody has any questions, you can write them in the Q&A. And then I have 5 questions that were submitted earlier. I did have one person who wrote me who I think she said she couldn't attend tonight, but she said that you reading 3 Junes was what inspired her to think she could be a writer.
Oh, that's great.
So I wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
Let's see. Have you ever been starstruck like Tommy when she first met Nick?
Okay. Now's where so when my older son and I were binge watching movies before I started writing that book, we watched a whole season of movies, all these male performances nominated for Academy Awards. And the one that just slayed me was Eddie Redmayne in The Theory of Everything. And it so happens that my younger son is kind of a ringer for Eddie Redmayne. He's like a miniature.
Oh, really?
Eddie Redmayne. Yeah, no, people would say, "What? He looks just like that movie," So, so the way I would describe it to people is that I got a mom crush on Eddie Redmayne. Got away, and also he's so gracious, And then he won all the awards, and my older son was really annoyed because he thought Michael Keaton should win the Oscar for whatever that movie was that he was nominated for. So we had big arguments, and he would say Eddie Redmayne is not the real deal and all this. So when I wrote the book, and you notice that I made Nick Green, the actor, British.
Right.
And the reason that I did this is that I don't know if you noticed that a whole bunch of British actors get to play American characters. It's like, wait a sec, why can't they get an American actor to play that role? Like, the one that just sort of blew my mind was Tom Hiddleston, Hank Williams. Like, come on, a country singer, like, go away, you masterpiece theater person. So I just thought it would be kind of a fun thing. And then as I was writing him, and my husband read, he goes, "Oh my God, it's Eddie Redmayne." I said, "No, it's not." Goes, "It's Eddie Redmayne." And I'm like, so I got very bristly about this. So when my husband read the finished manuscript, he gets to read it when it's finally done. And he's sitting in a separate room reading it. And I hear him suddenly shout, "No way!" He shouts, "No effing way!" And I went and I go, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "I am sorry." And there's a scene, you'll know what I mean when I say, when Nick Green sneaks into the Mort Lear's bedroom at night and opens his computer,
Right.
does something. So my husband was reading that scene. He goes, "Eddie Redmayne would never do this. In a million years would Eddie do this." I said, "It's not Eddie Redmayne." He goes, "Oh." So after that, we began to have this thing where we'd say, like, when somebody made some really poor decision, we're going to like, "Eddie would never do that." What would Eddie do? Like that sort of those WWJ.
Right.
So yes, it's fun to get starstruck. So yeah. So
Yep.
that was actually a direct tie-in to the novel.
I like it. Thank you for sharing. Do you still write short stories?
I don't, but a friend of mine, the writer, her name is Cheryl Tan, and she's a wonderful memoirist and novelist. Incredible novel called Sarong Party Girls. She also wrote a very successful food memoir called Tiger in the Kitchen. She and the writer Hilary Jordan, who wrote Mudbound,
Yeah.
I think that and they will forgive me if I say this, I think they went out to a bar and had a few too many glasses of wine and decided that they wanted to propose an anthology of short stories written by well-known contemporary writers that are all erotic short stories, like really graphic sex. But the kicker is, when the book is published, you'll see who the authors are, but it won't say which story is by which author. So I had a few too many glasses of wine with Cheryl one night, and she got me to commit to being in this anthology. So this anthology, and I thought they'll never sell this. They sold the anthology to a big publisher. So I have to write an erotic short story before March 1st. I kind of know what I'm going to do, but it's going to be a good challenge. I mean, after all, I teach short stories. My students mostly write short stories. We publish short stories together, and I should be able to return to that form. So this will be a challenge, and who knows, maybe it'll, my third book, I See You Everywhere, is really a collection of linked stories. It's actually not a novel, and it doesn't claim to be a novel, but it's, it should be read in order. But I did write those out of order. They did not get written in the order they appear in the book. So yeah. So
Well, good for you.
Yeah, good for me.
You have a challenge.
Yeah.
And you might have to drink a few more glasses of whatever you were drinking when you committed.
The things we say yes to.
One more question. How did A House Among the Trees get its title?
So titles are tough for me. There are some people who are really good at titles.
Your titles of the books within the book are so good, though.
Well, that's what's so funny is I have a friend who's a wonderful novelist named David Ebershoff, and he read this book, and when I was struggling with the title, he said, "Oh, I'm so terrible at titles," and he said to me, "Oh, come on, Julie, look at all the titles you came up with inside the book. How can you not come up with a title for the book?" I'm like, this just feels like there's so much at stake. But I actually originally called the book The Inseparables, because there is the book that Mort writes called The Inseparables, and I was thinking about Mort and Tommy and their kind of inseparable relationship. But my editor pointed out that there were a whole lot of books, like the time I thought of that, then the book The Interestings by Meg Walzer came out, and there was another book called The Indefatigables, or and she's just like, no, we really have to come up with something else. And I thought, well, I thought about trying to use names like Mort and Tommy, but that didn't sound very interesting, like something. And I played with the characters' names, and then I thought about the setting, and so it's a house, and I thought a house in the woods, a house and that is actually, so this is a fairy tale trope, right? The children go into the woods and they're lost, whether it's Hansel and Gretel. I mean, it could be a good figure or a figure of evil that, the traveling or lost people come upon, or the heroine or the hero in a fairy tale comes upon a house in the woods. And then I thought, oh, House Among the Trees. So my editor, I told her, I said, I don't know. And she said to me, oh, that's perfect, because that's from the beginning of Cloudquake. And I said, or Colorquake. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, it's the first line of that book. It's Evo lived in something in a house among the trees. And I didn't even remember.
Really?
No, I didn't. So
we brought it up on Tuesday. I'm like, well, there was a line, and then someone else was like, well, the house was back with the trees, and so people were just wondering. Yeah, that's funny that you didn't even recognize that.
Yeah. So the unconscious is a powerful thing.
It is. And this has been powerful. Thank you. We've really enjoyed having you here. I've enjoyed talking to you a lot. Thank you very much for taking your time, a lot of your time tonight to be with us.
Okay, it's been a great pleasure, and thank you for asking such good questions, and thank you for talking about the importance of bookstores and also for highlighting my involvement with 20 Summers, which is a special passion of mine.
Well, it's my pleasure. We're here to help everyone. Everyone know all the books. Everyone know all the bookstores. Everyone know all the literary nonprofits and arts nonprofits. And let's make this world a better place.
Let's do that for sure.
My small mission. Won't take any time. But thank you. And we look forward to seeing your book when it comes out, hopefully next year. And I will definitely be keeping my eye out for that short story anthology.
You'll know mine. It'll be the stodgiest story.
You may surprise yourself.
We'll see. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I hope the rest of your semester goes well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a good night. And everybody, thank you for joining us. If you haven't come to any of our events, this is your first one, we hope that you'll sign up for our newsletter and learn about other events we have coming up in the future. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.